According to Billboard, the Beatles have the most #1 singles of any musical group or individual, with 20 #1 singles. The Beatles broke up 53 years ago, and despite how many good and popular artists and bands that have been here in that time, none have yet surpassed this record, which speaks to the significance of the Beatles. So my credentials for talking about the Beatles are that I'm a big fan of the Beatles, and I went to a Paul McCartney concert, as you can see in this picture. The Beatles made a large impact I think it's important for you guys to learn because the Beatles made a large impact on music and on pop culture. And my goal is for you to know a little bit more about them. So here's how it's gonna go. We're first gonna be talking about the individual members, and then we'll talk about the music, and then we'll talk about the influence that the music had. So the four Beatles were made up of, so first we're going to be talking about the individual Beatles members and their contributions to the group. The Beatles were made up of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. John Lennon played the rhythm guitar, and he was one of the main songwriters of the group, along with Paul McCartney. He had a troubled childhood and often wrote about it in his music. In the early 70s, after the Beatles broke up, he wrote the song Imagine, which some of you know, and he joined the peace movement that protested against the Vietnam War. Unfortunately, he died in 1980 when he was assassinated, and he was only 40 years old at the time. So next is Paul McCartney. He was part of the main songwriting partnership with him and John, and they wrote most of the Beatles songs. Paul also wrote about his past like John did. Some of their most popular songs that they wrote together were I Want to Hold Your Hand, Hey Jude, and Come Together. Paul McCartney's music was also based on personal experience, but his songs tended to be more optimistic than John's songs. He spearheaded the move of the Beatles into more innovative and psychedelic sounds. And after the Beatles broke up, he had a very successful solo career. He's still alive today. He's 81. And like I said, I saw him last year in concert. George Harrison was the youngest Beatle, and he played the lead guitar. Later in the years of the band, he became a talented songwriter in his own right. He at first did not contribute to songwriting at all, but later in the band's history, he really did contribute to the songwriting. He wrote some of the most popular songs. Like he wrote Here Comes the Sun and Something. George Harrison was also more spiritual, and in the late 60s and 70s, he got into Hinduism more. Unfortunately, he died in 2001 due to lung cancer. So last but not least is Ringo Starr. He was the drummer of the group, and he joined last, but they wanted him to join because he was known as the best drummer in Liverpool, which was the city that all four Beatles came from. His catchphrase is peace and love, which he uses in almost every one of his Instagram captions. He is 83 years old today. So now that we've talked about the individual Beatles members, we're going to talk about their music. So, according to Rolling Stone, the first single they released was Love Me Do in October 1962. Their first album, Please Please Me, was released in the following year. So, the Beatles' first 5 albums, which spanned from 1963 to 1965, were good in their own right, but they were more generic and more similar to each other. They fit the mold of what was expected of them more. But then with the albums Rubber Soul and Revolver, I have Rubber Soul right here, they branched out with their sound a little more. They started writing about more personal things. And then with Sgt. Pepper's, they completely changed their look and their sound, their music, and everything. So before Sgt. Pepper's, they all had mop tops. Their hair looked relatively similar, as you can see in this picture. But then in 1967, when Sgt. Pepper's came out, they all started growing mustaches and facial hair, and their hair started growing out more, which inspired many other people to do the same, many other men of the time to do the same thing. So the next couple albums after Sgt. Pepper's are some of their most memorable albums, with Abbey Road being the most memorable. Yeah. Abbey Road was the most memorable album, in my opinion. And their last album was released in 1970. That was Let It Be. And it was released a month after the band publicly broke up. All right, after talking about music, we're going to talk about the influence that the Beatles had on music and how it's still relevant to today. So, one of their influences on music is that they inspired more singer-songwriters. So, before the Beatles started writing their own music, often if it was a band of their caliber, it would be an older middle-aged writer or group of writers writing the songs for a younger idol to sing. But the Beatles started the notion of a singer-songwriter, which is a singer and a songwriter. They also encouraged people to write about their more personal experiences, as that's what they did. And these writing about the personal experiences made them more better. In writing about these personal experiences made it helped the audience to connect to their music more. This can be seen in this can be seen in the song Nowhere Man, where John wrote about his state of mind, and in the song Here, There, and Everywhere, where Paul wrote about his girlfriend at the time, Jane Asher, and his love for her. So, in addition to inspiring others to become songwriters and singers, they inspired more creativity in the studio and with the instruments. I'm screwed. They inspired more creativity in the studio and with the instruments. So they used more unconventional and different instruments. So they used an orchestra for songs like Yesterday and Eleanor Rigby, and they used the sitar for songs like Norwegian Wood and For You Too. Using these different instruments in the songs brought the emotion of the songs out more, and it allowed the listener to feel what they were trying to convey with the combination of the words and the melodies. So they influenced many musicians to come. Roger Waters, pictured right there, was quoted saying about the Beatles, "It was okay to write about our lives and express how we felt. It gave me and my generation permission to branch out," which is quoted in You Discover. More recently, Lady Gaga said about Abbey Road, "It's so incredibly brilliant, an innate sense of joy. They really had that down," which is quoted in Gigwise. So as you can see, the influence of the Beatles is still prevalent today. In conclusion, the Beatles were very influential with the music they made and the words that they wrote. They were made up of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. They had 13 studio albums, and they had a big influence on music. I hope you guys learned something more about the Beatles today. Thank you. Dear goodness.